Welcome everyone to the Power of the Disability Vote. My name is Kylie Ballo and I am the Program Operations Coordinator and I'll be your tech support for the evening. And I am happy to introduce Maria Town, the President and CEO of AAPID, who will be our presenter of the evening. Just a little bit about Include NYC. For more than 3 decades, we've been helping young people with disabilities, their families, and professionals. We help New York City families make informed decisions about special education, navigating the disability systems, and advocating for themselves. We offer a variety of workshops, a helpline, and resources which we're adapting to respond to coronavirus-related school closures. I will be sharing the phone number for our helpline as well as our link to our website in the chat box. If you guys are, whether you're an Include NYC veteran or you're joining us for the first time, we're glad you're here and hope you'll participate. If you have any questions throughout, feel free to drop them into the Q&A box. And if you have any technical issues or thoughts, you can put them in the chat box. Again, thank you all for joining us, and I'm going to pass the floor over to Maria Town, who will be our presenter for the evening. Thanks all.
Hi everyone, and my name is Maria Town, and I serve as the President and CEO of the American Association of People with Disabilities. I want to thank Include NYC for the invitation to speak to you all this evening for this webinar focused on the power of the disability vote. AAPD, the American Association of People with Disabilities, is a national cross-disability civil rights organization, and we focus on building the economic and political power of people with disabilities across the United States. I said we are a cross-disability organization, and that means that we don't focus on a specific kind of disability or disability experience or diagnosis. Instead, we push for policies, solutions, and programs that serve all people with disabilities across the spectrum of the disability experience, from people like me who were born with developmental disabilities like cerebral palsy, to folks who have aged into disability or maybe have a chronic health condition. One of the reasons that I wanted to spend a little bit of time describing the diversity within the disability community is because sometimes we can get a little bit stuck when we think about the disability community as a kind of just one type of person kind of counts. And when we're talking about the disability community and the disability vote, we are actually talking about a huge number of people. So there are 61 million people with disabilities in the United States, and of those 65 million, more than 35 million of them are eligible voters with disabilities. The disability vote, the disability voting bloc, is one of the largest voting blocs in the United States. And you may not realize that, because oftentimes candidates for elected office, people in elected office, don't talk about us that much. And there may be a few reasons why that happens. And I want to talk with all of you about what some of those reasons are and about how we continue to build the power of the disability vote. So, as I already mentioned, people with disabilities, there are 35 million eligible voters with disabilities in the United States. And if you include family members, friends, people, roommates who might live with a person with a disability, the disability vote grows to 62 million. It's an incredible number. However, we still see really big gaps between the participation of people with disabilities when it comes to voting and people without disabilities. Right now, if people with disabilities voted at the same rate as people without disabilities, we would see 2.2 million more voters in the general election. And let me remind you, the 2016 presidential election was decided by 100,000 votes in a couple of states. And so sometimes we might feel like one vote doesn't make a difference, but it can. So there's this participation gap. What causes that? Well, there's a number of things that can cause that participation gap between voters with and without disabilities. One thing that I've heard quite a bit, especially lately, is that some people with disabilities don't feel like they should be allowed to vote. People with learning disabilities or intellectual disabilities. And I want to say that unless a judge has told you that you can't vote, any person with a disability who is eligible, meaning over 18, can register to vote and cast their ballot. Now, I'm going to assume that everyone on this call is in New York, and so it may look different based on your state, the ways that you register, what kind of documentation you need to bring when you go to the polls. But if you are, again, a person who is going to turn 18 by the election date, or already over 18, and you're a person with a disability, guess what? You can register to vote. And you should vote. The other thing that you should know is that if you need assistance voting, whether it's reading the ballot or getting to the polls or maybe operating the polling device, it is okay to ask for assistance, either understanding the issues or voting yourself. The Americans with Disabilities Act entitles all of us as disabled people to things called reasonable accommodations, and reasonable accommodations happen in polling places. Sometimes states will have specific rules around what kind of assistance can be provided or who can provide assistance at a polling place. Typically, they don't want your employer to provide assistance at the polling place, or a union member, because they don't want anyone who may threaten your job, for example, to provide assistance. But you could get a friend, a family member, a neighbor to help provide assistance at the polls. One of the things that that we talk about a lot in disability rights spaces are ideas of dignity, and how every person with a disability deserves dignity and deserves to be seen as a whole person. Especially in the United States, in our democracy, one of the ways we think about personhood and citizenship and who belongs is through voting. So voting is a part of community belonging. And when we think about community integration and making sure that people with disabilities can contribute to the many varied aspects of life in their communities, voting should be a part of that. One of the other interesting things that you all might enjoy hearing is that people with disabilities who are employed actually vote at the same rate as non-disabled people who are employed. And so it's really interesting. Once you start building that community connection with individuals with disabilities, we want to vote. We understand that so much of the systems that we use, whether it's transit or Medicaid, depend on our vote. So I wanted to talk with you a little bit about one of the things that AAPD is really focused on. It's an initiative called Rev Up. Rev Up stands for Register, Educate, Vote, Use Your Power. And again, voting is one of the ways that we as disabled people really use our power to tell our elected officials what matters to us. So I'm going to share my screen to show you all our Rev Up page. Let me go back to find the button. And so you can see here, this is the AAPD website. We're going to voting. And here you see Rev Up, Register, Educate, Vote, Use Your Power. On this page, we have a variety of resources, and I'm going to talk through some of them. One of them that I wanted to make sure all of you saw was our actual webpage where you can register yourself to vote. You put in your email address and your zip code, and you go through a series of steps to check your voter registration to make sure it's accurate, and if it's not, to register to vote. There are some states that don't allow online voter registration, but if you live in a state that does, you can register to vote via this site. We are already, at the end of September, in the election. Many people may be talking about the November 3rd election day, and that's great, but some states have already started voting, including New York. Ballots have already been sent out to individuals. So, you know, a key thing is learning and checking your voter registration deadline and making sure that all of your information is in before that deadline so that you can vote. And I'll share this in the chat. Another page, and this has already been shared in the chat, I've just talked about a whole bunch of statistics. And we have a page that shows all the statistics and data related to people with disabilities and voter registration. One of the things that's really exciting, again, I mentioned that we are beginning to change the tides to build the power of the disability vote. In the 2018 midterm elections, we saw more people with disabilities vote than ever before. The disability vote actually surged by 8.5% in 2018. And compared to the 2014 midterm election, in states where we have a Rev Up coalition, we saw the disability vote grow by 9%. And so we have a whole chart that shows how much the disability vote has grown between 2014 and 2018 in all of our Rev Up states. And then we have a map for people who are better with visuals like me, as well as many other statistics. You all may have a lot of questions about voting, especially this year. One key thing that's changed quite a bit is COVID-19, and many people are worried about catching COVID and becoming very sick if they go to a polling place and vote. Some states are really stressing vote by mail, and that is a great option for many people with disabilities who might be concerned about COVID. But maybe vote by mail isn't accessible to you if you're someone who is blind or low vision, or if you have a learning disability, or if you're like me, sometimes my hands spasm and it's difficult for me to fill out a paper form. So voting in person is a better option for you. We have a FAQ on voting in 2020. And it goes through, it explains what vote by mail is, what absentee voting is, if vote by mail is secure, which states have it, and some of the deadlines. We also talk about how you fill out your ballot, and then what you need to do if you want to vote by in person. One of the things you can do if you're worried about being next to people at a polling place during COVID is do curbside voting if that's available in your state. You can also, excuse me, see if your state has something called electronic ballot delivery. So states will maybe send you your ballot via email, and you can read it at home. And understand the choices you're going to make before you go to the polling place, so that when you get into the booth, you can cast your ballot very quickly. Sometimes we experience discrimination when we vote, and barriers at the polls. You know, even every time, so I used to live in Texas, and when I lived in Texas, every time I tried to vote, they tried to tell me that I couldn't. One reason was because I did not have a driver's license, and many of you on this call may not have a driver's license too, whether you're a person with a disability who doesn't drive or you're just a New Yorker who doesn't drive. So I had to be prepared to tell the poll workers, no, I can vote, these are my rights. So in addition to knowing deadlines and what you're going to vote for, it's also important to know what to do if you encounter a barrier. There are great entities called protection and advocacy providers who have part of their whole mission is to make sure that people with disabilities can participate in elections. And in New York, you all have great P&As. But you should know, what kind of identification do I need to bring to the polling place to make sure that I can vote? What do I do if my polling place isn't accessible? Who do I report it to? What do I do if for some reason the accessible machine doesn't work? Unfortunately, and this is another reason why we see that big gap between voters with and without disabilities, people with disabilities encounter so many barriers when we try to vote. And yet, everybody, what do we do when we encounter barriers? We organize, we fight back, we try to make sure that things are accessible and inclusive. And again, it may not seem like it, but just as you would write a letter to your city council member if you couldn't get into a local restaurant, or if an employer refused to hire you, if you don't vote, it means that you're saying disability issues aren't important. Justin Dart, who was the grandfather of the Americans with Disabilities Act, he has a quote. He said, "Vote like your life depends on it, because it does." And that was never more true than it is today. Our elected officials determine which services we receive, what kinds of civil rights are prioritized. They determine our benefits dollars. And so when you think about all of the different ways that your day-to-day life is impacted by policies that your alderman, your city council person, your county clerk impacts, it's so important to register to vote and to cast your ballot, not just in the November general election for president, but in every local election, again, from city council to the Senate. So with that, I will stop and open it up for questions. So I've seen there's a comment that says, "Thanks for all this important information. Voting is so important, especially during this election cycle." I completely agree. I don't see, does RevUp have any info in Spanish and other languages? We do. I'm gonna have to, I'll pull it from our website and send it out to Include NYC. We are trying to get, so one of the things that we're developing right now is state by state voting guides. And as I mentioned, voting is administered at the state level. There are not many federal standards that impact what you experience at your polling place. There's the ADA, there's the Help America Vote Act, but in terms of timing, how vote by mail is administered, who can and cannot vote, those are all state level decisions. And so we are building and will release Monday state by state guides that will also be translated into Spanish. And so I'll be sure to get that to you. So where can we get this info and data on the disability vote to share with people later? That's been shared in the chat, and I think it's been sent out to you in an email. There's we worked with scholars from Rutgers University to pull all this data together. So there are even more detailed reports from Rutgers on the power of the disability vote, and I'm happy to send even more information along to Include NYC. Are there other questions? Well, one of the other things that I'm really excited to talk about, we just released this today, and I'm going to share my screen again, is a report on COVID and the disability vote. As I mentioned, COVID poses some unique challenges to people with disabilities who are seeking to vote. And so this report provides 9 recommendations. I believe it's 6 state and local recommendations and 3 federal recommendations to ensure that this election and future elections are safe and accessible. One of our strongest recommendations is to expand vote by mail, no excuse absentee balloting, and online voter registration. I'll go back to Texas. Texas does not allow online voter registration. There are more states do today than previously, but some states make it very, very difficult to register to vote. Despite the access issues with vote by mail, expanding vote by mail across all states so that people will automatically receive their ballots with appropriate postage, so that it's so easy to vote from home and not have to worry about becoming exposed to COVID, is also incredibly important. Our second recommendation is to allow electronic ballot delivery. Again, paper ballots are inherently inaccessible to so many people. And for states that allow electronic ballot delivery, assistive tech can read the ballot online, so that, again, someone who has a learning disability or who's blind can understand the choices they're making. There's still issues with them having to print out the ballot, affirm that it's the correct choice, and sign it. But every state having electronic ballot delivery would make a big difference. And again, as we've discussed, vote by mail is not going to be an option for everyone. So we need to make in-person voting as safe as possible, which includes expanding early vote so that lines at polling places are reduced. It also means making sure that polling places can remain open. One of the things that we saw in both Georgia and Kentucky during their primaries is that they closed so many polling places and created these mega polling places in sports arenas, and it was just a mess of potential COVID exposure. We also want to make sure, and this is a real challenge that is that always exists, but is particularly difficult during COVID. Congregate settings like nursing homes and group homes have established very restrictive visitor policies to prevent COVID exposure and spread. One of the things that would typically happen is someone from a Center for Independent Living or other disability serving organization or a League of Women Voters might go to a congregate setting like a nursing home to register people to vote. That is not happening right now. And so we need to make sure that states are adapting those restricted visitor policies to allow folks engaged in voter registration efforts to make sure that people living in group homes, for example, are registered to vote and are able to cast their ballots. At the federal level, just so you all are aware, we have really been advocating for the federal government to provide states with funding to expand vote by mail and, again, make improvements to polling places without matching the funds. We also really want the federal government to pass the newly named John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2020. And the Voting Rights Act is focused on making sure that marginalized communities like the disability community do not experience disenfranchisement or voter suppression, and it was passed by the House almost a year ago, and it's been sitting in the Senate. This report is very long, but I believe it's been sent out to you as well, and I'm very excited about it because we just put it out a few hours ago. Are there other questions? Are accommodations available in early voting or just on election day? Accommodations are available in both early voting and on election day. Again, early voting looks different in every state. Sometimes it looks different by county, but anytime a person with a disability goes to vote, even when it's vote by mail, they can receive accommodations. There's a question from Linda. Does my slow registration online? I'm not sure what the question is asking, and if Linda can clarify. Linda asks, I can go in the booth with my granddaughter who can't read and help her. Yes, you can. Yes, you can. One of the things that I wasn't able to pull up before our call, we actually created, again, a specific guide for New Yorkers, as well as a spreadsheet that goes through the kinds of assistance that each state allows in the booth when someone goes to vote. And I will make sure that gets sent out to you all. Should people bring any material to cite their rights to polling places? You can. You have to be a little careful. So a lot of polling places will not allow you to bring in a cell phone or a tablet. So if you're going to bring in material to cite your rights to a polling place, the best option is for it to be in hard copy in a paper format. And then Elizabeth again asks, what should I do if my polling place is not accessible? Who should I contact? So there are a few different entities that you can contact. You can contact your protection and advocacy provider. You can also contact your local boards of election. And again, I wish I had this information off the top of my head. Give me 1 second and I will find it. I'm gonna pull something up. Okay. So can you all still see my screen? I think so. So this is our spreadsheet that contains information about disability voter rights in every state. And Elizabeth, are you in New York? Yes. Okay. So New York does have online voter registration. You can mail in your registration. It does not allow people to register to vote on election day. The voter registration, this is really interesting, and I haven't seen this in many states. In New York, the general voter registration deadline is the 9th of October, which is in a week and a half, or the 24th of October if it's done through a Disability Rights New York protection and advocacy, voter advocacy advocate. So again, if you're a person with a disability who is registering through someone who works with the protection and advocacy provider, you actually get 2 additional weeks to register to vote. And then I'm going to scroll to the end. You can see how much information this spreadsheet tracks. I'm going to scroll to the end to see if, so right now we're not aware if New York has a specific hotline for voters with disabilities, but the protection and advocacy provider is Disability Rights New York. And I'm sure you all are familiar with them. So they're one of the places you can report your issue to. The other places are the US Department of Justice, and again, your local boards of election, and that would be at your county level, and then at the city level. So another interesting thing is if you're voting absentee in New York, you can get assistance to fill out your ballot, but they don't require that the person assisting you provide a signature. And thank you for linking to Disability Rights New York in the chat. But this spreadsheet is also on our website in case you want to learn more about what various rules are across the states. Interestingly, a state like North Dakota actually doesn't require, doesn't do early voting and doesn't require that you register to vote in advance. So again, it can really, really vary by state. See some more questions, I think. What is the registration deadline in New York? So again, it's October 9th, and the general registration deadline, and it is October 24th if you're registering with a Disability Rights New York voter advocate. Do I need proof of my granddaughter's disability to go in the booth with her, or do they accept my word? Or do I tell the disability when I register her? So no, you don't need to state the disability when you register her. You also, so let's check something out for New York. One of the things I mentioned earlier was the need for something called no excuse absentee balloting. And so some states require that you disclose a disability in order to vote by mail or vote absentee. I'm fairly certain New York does not require that. And you would not need to need proof of your granddaughter's disability when you go to the polling place to vote. I think you would need to tell the poll worker that your granddaughter has a disability and that you are going to assist her with her vote, but you don't need proof, nor do you need to say what the disability is. Let's see something. So New York does not have curbside voting. And when you're providing assistance, it cannot be an employer, an employee, the candidate themselves, or a union leader or member. Thank you for your question, Linda. I really appreciate all your questions. So I will just flag, you know, the voter registration, the general voter registration deadline is very soon. Again, you can go to this website to get registered, and whether you're a person with a disability, a service provider, a family member, just know every single person with a disability should have the right to vote. And when I think about the possibilities that could happen if all of us were actually registered and utilized our most sacred right to vote, how different the world would be. I just get really excited by it. And so I hope that all of you who are on this call will, you know, not only talk to your friends and family members, but people people in your communities about making sure their registration is accurate, getting registered and voting now, potentially now or in November. Jane and Elizabeth, thank you so much for your kind words. I'm really happy to talk with you. We do have a Rev Up chapter in New York. And so if you all are interested in being connected to the Rev Up chapter, I would be happy to put y'all in touch. My email is mtown@aapd pd.com. And the New York chapter is doing really good work. We just gave them a small grant to get more people with disabilities registered. If I can talk a little bit about something that's not directly related to voting, but very important. I want to talk about the US Census. Now we're going to the ARC page. They have such a great census page. The census is how the United States determines both funding and power. It is it's a count that's done of everyone in the United States every 10 years. And the results of the census determine what kind of funding states get for things like SNAP, what kinds of funding schools get to support students with disabilities, things like Medicaid. And there's been a lot of discussion around the census and when the deadline is. So right now, the deadline to get counted in the census is the end of October, October 30th. I would say the sooner you get counted, the better. But it is, again, really important to get counted. If the counts of people shrink because not enough people filled out the census, it could mean either that you lose representation in Congress or that your city, your town, your county, your state gets less funding for the services that you and your family members need to survive. The census funding also, since the census counts also tell us, how many people with disabilities live in the United States, which states have more people with disabilities. It's very important, not only in the resources that it helps shape, but also in how we as a movement talk about ourselves. And AAPD has done some work on the census. We consider it a part of our kind of civic engagement portfolio. So again, if you haven't gotten counted in the census, or if you have questions, please let me know. Any further questions or comments? Was a link shared to the report on the census? No, but I can share one right now. We don't have a report on the census. We have some other materials, but I can also share this is a link to the ARC of the United States, their page on the census. And then I will also share Um, this is information about responding to the census. And thanks to the include staff who are making sure that all the links get to y'all. I will just add one thing that may happen in the election is that because there are so many people voting by mail, we may not know who the winner of the election is on November 3rd, or November 4th, or November 5th. It may take a long time to determine who who the next president of the United States will be. And if either candidate, President Trump or Vice President Biden, are concerned that there's been suppression to not count all of the votes, they may file a lawsuit that is decided by the courts. And so again, someone said, thanks for bringing that up, the sooner we can vote, the better. And I couldn't agree more. Like if you are voting in person, vote early. If you're voting by mail, request your ballot ASAP and send it in as soon as possible to make sure that it gets counted. When you, and we don't have this information, but states and other organizations will often track ballots if you're voting by mail. So for example, in Virginia, the state of Virginia has a ballot tracker, so you can track when the state receives your vote to make sure that it gets counted. I can check to see if New York has that. I'm not sure if anyone who's on the line knows. Sorry if this is, so there's a question, and I'm not sure how to say your name. Kapana, did I say that correctly? Pana, okay. All polling sites are mandated to be accessible by the Americans with Disabilities Act. However, a Government Accountability Office study recently found that at least anywhere from 60 to 80% of all polling places had at least one access barrier. It's a really tricky issue. Oftentimes, places that hold significance in a particular community are used as polling places, but places like churches are not required to be accessible by the Americans with Disabilities Act. There is a religious exemption. And so it's very tricky because we've actually seen the ADA be used to suppress votes of voters of color in Georgia because they shut down a number of inaccessible polling places and didn't reopen any, other accessible polling places in areas that are predominantly composed of people of color. And so, we would like to see more funding to the states to remove access barriers at polling places. There's also each polling place is required to have one accessible machine. Sometimes that machine doesn't work. Sometimes it's not plugged in correctly. Sometimes poll workers don't know how to operate it. So the other thing that we often advocate for is to make sure that poll workers are trained on how to operate accessible machines and how to engage with voters with disabilities. But to answer your question again, yes, polling places are required to be accessible, but unfortunately, they're often not. Are there any further questions or comments? What should I do if I get to my polling place and it is not accessible on election day? So there's a few things that you can do. One is you can report it to the Protection to Disability Rights New York. I'm not sure. So one of the other things that can be really helpful to voters with disabilities is making sure that they have county-wide polling places so that you don't have to go to a single specific polling site that may or may not be accessible. You can also, New York doesn't allow curbside voting, but it is possible that due to inaccessibility, a poll worker can bring a ballot out to you. If you need an accessible machine, technically they are required to bring the accessible machine out to you. But you, regardless of the inaccessibility of your polling place, you are entitled to figure out a way to vote in whatever way will work for you. So again, you can report it to Disability Rights New York. I'm not sure if you could go to another polling place or you would have to vote at that polling place, but you should make sure that poll workers know that the polling site is inaccessible and determine what's necessary to get you to vote. So is it that someone brings you a ballot, brings you a machine? In some places, they can bring a machine to your home so that you can vote. During COVID, that gets tricky. I want to ask all of you a question while I have a few minutes. Do all of you have a plan to vote? And I know I told Include that I wasn't doing a poll, but if you can maybe use the raise your hand or reaction function. I'm not sure if that's available to y'all. Okay, so Lisa has a plan to vote. Belinda has a plan to vote. I think Linda is getting her plan together, it sounds like. Hannah is voting in person. She voted, or they voted absentee during the primaries. Hannah, why are you voting in person this time when you voted absentee in the primaries? Elizabeth says that she has a plan. She's voting in person early. And Jane says that they have some young people that they would like to help vote. And Pana says that they want to see the ballot go into the machine. They feel uneasy about mailing it in, even though they know it is safe. And Pana, your experience is similar to so many people with disabilities that we are hearing from. The United States Postal Service made quite a few changes to, they did a big reorganization recently that resulted in significant delays. those delays have negatively impacted people with disabilities, and AAPD and the National Council on Disability collected over 100 stories of people with disabilities who have been impacted by the changes at the Postal Service. Many people are people like Pana who have voted absentee before, but this time they are voting in person because they are concerned that their vote won't get counted if they send it by mail. But as Pana said, voting by mail is safe and secure, but there are, again, many people who feel the exact same way. Michael is working with the local election office to come up with an accessible option for mail-in. I'm visually impaired. I'm in Illinois. Michael, there have been a number of lawsuits recently in Virginia, in Vermont, North Carolina, I want to say New Hampshire too, that have required those states to come up with an accessible mail-in ballot. And so I want to make sure that you're connected to advocates in Illinois who may be working on this. I think there probably are people, particularly those who are involved in the Illinois chapter of the Illinois Council of the Blind or the Illinois chapter of the National Federation of the Blind. But we have seen some good progress on that. The other thing that we talk about quite a bit is that members of the US military who are abroad have voted electronically for decades in a program called UACAVA. And so we often cite that as a means to say, why isn't this expanded to everyone? At minimum, voters with disabilities for whom mail-in balloting is inaccessible. And Michael, we have some language in our COVID report that might be helpful to you. Yes, and Lisa says space explorers also vote digitally from space. Yes, there was a story about an astronaut who's voting from space this year that made me really happy. Pana also plans to vote early to avoid crowds, and I think that's a great strategy. Sometimes counties and states will have websites that show the length of line at particular polling places. And so if you're voting in person, you should be able to look up polling places, your polling place, to see how long the line is and how many people are there to decide when you want to vote. Linda says that she is going to register my granddaughter and go with her in the booth and hope I do not encounter a problem. Linda, I really hope you don't either. But I want to make sure you are connected to Disability Rights New York just in case you do. And Michael says, thank you. I've been in touch with my state representative. They've been very helpful advocating for me at the state level. And Michael, you have two fantastic champions in the Senate, one being US Senator Tammy Duckworth, and the other one being Dick Durbin. They are both big champions for people with disabilities, and so you may consider writing a letter to your senators. Yeah. I'm glad to see so many of you have plans to vote. I wish I saw that everybody had a plan to vote, but I hope this conversation has been helpful with you all thinking through what your plan to vote might be. I live in Washington, D.C. right now, and my plan to vote is to vote by mail. My ballot will be sent to me, and I will send it back in by mail. My ballot is on the counter, just got it today. That's very exciting. Linda says, thank you for the information. And I'll just say thank you to all of you for hanging out with me this evening and talking about this really important issue. And thank you, Michael. Yeah, I think AAPD can do so much more too on this topic, and we will do more work together with advocates like all of you.